Okay, so this isn't actually my story, but my grandparents, and would have occurred in the 1970s. My grandparents were hanging out with some friends on the other side of town when they decided it was getting late and began to head home to relieve the babysitter. They hopped in the car and set off for their house. At the time, they were living in the countryside, so they were driving down quiet, narrow roads through large fields. My grandmother said she remembered being extremely tired, so she started nodding off, staring at the window. But then she saw something large and unusual moving in those otherwise empty fields. Curious, she asked my grandfather to slow down so she could get a better look at it. When they got a look at it at the reduced speed, they started discussing what kind of animal it could be. My grandfather, who was a hunter, was also intrigued because at his angle, it looked like a large bear, but he couldn't figure out why a large bear would be in a big field like that. Eventually, my grandfather stopped the car completely, staring at the moving mass in the distance. All of a sudden, they were stunned as the creature stood to reveal the figure of an abnormally large and muscular man, or ape, which was very strange given how late it was and the fact that there was no species of ape in that area. Add to that there weren't any residential or commercial buildings nearby, and this sighting was very strange. After a few minutes of gawking as the creature stood now motionless in the distance, they agreed that they should continue home and find the owner of the land and tell them about this possible trespasser in the morning. Slowly, my grandfather began to drive, though him and my grandmother were still unable to look away from the unusual being. It began to run parallel to the vehicle in the distance, revealing that it did indeed run in the fashion of a gorilla or other large apes. My grandfather then accelerated, but the creature kept pace, remaining in line with them. Terrifyingly, it was reaching a speed of 30 miles per hour. Stunned, my grandfather began to test the beast and he put the car in reverse. Once again, it followed them. Now, my grandparents weren't necessarily scared during this interaction, but rather amused and fascinated. They kept going in reverse and drive to see what the creature would do, and he mirrored them every time. This went on for a few minutes before my grandparents had their fill and stopped their car, laughing and theorizing what that thing could be in the field. But their laughter was suddenly interrupted as the creature came charging at a high speed straight for them, as though intending to do damage. Now they were frightened. My grandfather sped off, leaving it far behind them. That was the only and last time either of them had ever seen a beast like that. Before I start, I'm going to say that this story is 100% true, and I remember it because of what my brother said after he went on his walk earlier. This has haunted me for years, and I've lost hours of sleep over it. But enough stalling. Time to tell the world what me and my family continue to experience. One night, around 6 or 7 years ago, I had a cat whom I was very close to. But I had a friend over and my twin brother. My cat got out, which wouldn't have been a big issue, but the problem is, my family owns 200 acres of woodland. It used to be Creek Native American land. So me, my brother, and my friend all went out to look for the cat. But something was different about that night. It was very quiet from the time we got out there. Even my 3 dogs were quiet, but they were on guard, ready to attack anything in the night. We ignored the eerie silence as we looked for the cat. But it was so weird because not even the crickets were chirping. As we moved to the barn on our land, all 3 of my dogs were going crazy, snarling, barking, and growling. We were terrified, but we kept looking for my feline friend out of some naive hope. As we searched the barn, the stench of a dead skunk filled the air. That putrid smell attracted a turkey vulture, and it was perched as it flapped its wings. Seeing that vulture's monstrous wingspan startled all of us. Then the vulture swooped over my head, only clearing it by like an inch, before something grabbed it out of the sky. Now, although it was dark, we did all have flashlights, including me, who had a headband light. So we turned over to where the vulture got snatched, and we watched him get mauled right in front of our eyes by a massive, black-haired creature. It looked up at us as it had the guts of that vulture dripping from its mouth. Its eyes reflected the light from our flashlights, giving it a menacing glow. But that's not what scared me the most. The most horrifying feature was that it had the face of a man, but with hair all over. I stood in fear, basically in shock. My friend yelled at me and she grabbed me as we ran and jumped the gate to the barn. My brother was behind us, but he was having a hard time jumping the gate. I looked back and he finally got the gate open, but not before that thing almost grabbed him. As we ran into the house, we caught our breath and waited a moment before confirming what we saw. My friend was scared out of her mind, so she decided to stay the night with us. The next morning we went back to find blood footprints, but the one thing that disturbed us more than that was the bird's body being strung up in a tree. That imagery gave me so many nightmares. Ever since that day, I've continued to see this thing several times. And I don't care if you think I'm crazy. I know what I saw, smelt, and even felt. And it was not a normal human. This incident happened a long time ago, and I haven't told too many people about it. I'm a 31-year-old Native American, and I was 6 or 7 when this happened. I am glad to know that there are people who actually take this seriously. It was night, and my sister and cousin were playing around on the phone. They would dial our number and hang up the phone so it would ring. They had music playing very loudly, and were just playing around. The doorbell rang, and one of us answered the door, but there was no one there, and this happened 2 more times. We had a little house dog, and my sister and cousin noticed that the dog was crouched under a chair in our living room. The final time the doorbell rang, we all went outside and couldn't see no one around. It was maybe half an hour later, and my oldest brother went to the refrigerator. The rest of us kids were playing in the hallway when he came running down the hallway with his hands to his face. He ran in our parents' room and belly flopped on a bed, hysterical about what he just experienced. He was inconsolable and crying like a baby. We all kept asking what was wrong, and he finally told us what he saw. He said he saw something peeking around a tree, and it was motioning for him to come out. That's when he freaked out. After about 15 minutes, he had calmed down some, but then we heard some knocking at the back door. And the way they were knocking, it was as if they were telling us to open the door now. When we opened the door, a guy who lived a few houses away came in white as a sheet, and he was shaking pretty badly. He said he broke down a ways from our place, and when he was walking up the road, he heard something walking in the woods with him. He didn't know what it was. He said he was really glad to see our lights on. Our parents weren't home. My mother was working, and we didn't know where our father was. So we ended up calling our uncles, who lived next door to us. They arrived a few minutes after we called them, and they had their guns with them. They came and talked with the one guy who came to our house. I think one of my uncles took him home. There were 6 of us kids at the home at the time, and my uncles went outside to look around. My older sister and our cousin wanted to go too, but the St. Bernard got in their way, and they couldn't get around him because of his size, and he even started growling at them. They backed up a little bit so he can get inside the house, and when he was out of the way, they continued outside. They were standing on a little trail by the house when they noticed a dark form at the bottom of the trail. They thought maybe it was a stump, but then the stump moved and turned to look at them. My cousin said it had red eyes, and it looked straight at them. They came back inside right away. After regaining her composure, my cousin went right back out, but this time she went out the back door and circled around to the front. When she got to the corner of her house, she looked up towards my uncle's garage, and she saw something peeking around the garage. She said she thought it was one of our other cousins, but she noticed it had a cone-shaped head, and it looked around the garage towards our house. They ended up putting 3 of us kids to bed. My sister and I were pretty scared, and my baby brother didn't really know what was going on. We were shaking pretty badly as we tried to go to sleep. Our brother's bed was right next to the window. We were really hoping whatever was out there didn't come to our window and try to take him. That's when the most bone-chilling thing you could ever imagine happened. A large dark figure passed by our window. We were so scared. It seemed like forever when our parents got home. When they did, we told them what happened. My mother ended up calling a spiritual guide, and he told her that there were probably 3 of those things around the house that night. He also told her that they were looking for a boy to take. He said that one of them may have lost one of their own, and they came looking for a young boy to replace the one they lost. I parked the truck at a big bog campsite, and set up a small dome tent. I then started walking and scouting down the trail till I reached the old log trail that circles the waterfowl refuge. Halfway around, I found a well-used animal trail. I took a picture and continued on. About midway through the refuge, I found another animal trail on a bottleneck that led to the water's edge. I followed it to the edge, but there were no tracks. Finally, I got to the creek and noticed cattails pulled up and flattened on the other side. I took a picture of that as well. I walked all the way around until it joined up with the road. From there, I followed the other road back to the trail and back to the truck at my campsite. In total, this was about a 3-mile hike, and it took me about 2 hours. I had a couple of Pop-Tarts and a Snickers bar as a snack, and started to set up my game cams around the camp. I put 2 facing in at the truck and tent, and 3 facing away into the surrounding woods. I then threw out apples all around the camp area, and put slices of fresh beef liver about 20 feet in front of both cams facing camp. I poured some honey in front of the other 3 cams, and topped it off with black licorice. Since I planned on sleeping in the truck, I put a pheromone chip on a stick next to my small dome tent. Inside the tent, I put a small sound recorder of snoring that I recorded earlier when I was at home. When I was ready to go to sleep, my plan was to turn on the recorder and play the snoring sounds while I slept in the safety of the truck. You know, a bluff tactic. After this was all done and ready, I sat down on my tailgate and ate a can of soup. When I was done eating, I tied a string about 10 feet to my belt loop. On the other end of the string, I tied a used tampon and a pheromone chip. My plan was simple. I have done this with tarsal glands and doe and heat during deer season. I had intended to leave a scent trail back to where I would want the deer to travel and go for a good shoot. The plan this time was to go once again around the same route I took earlier, that being the waterfowl refuge straight back to my camp. It was going to be a big loop that led whatever would follow straight into my camp. It was getting kind of late, close to 6:30 p.m., so I put my pistol on my belt with my knife and canteen, and I headed on my way, dragging behind the string attachments. As I walked along, I would take out my canteen and pour a little water on the chip and tampon so it would leave a damp trail, and every now and again I would step on them to soak a spot with the scent. Instead of going straight through and around the refuge as I did the first time, this time I went and checked out the walking bridge by the old clear cut and sat on the bridge for an hour just listening to nature. It was totally still, not even a breeze, and off in the distance towards the creek, I could hear a bunch of crows going off over something. It was getting late and would be dark soon, so I started back towards the trail around the refuge. When I got to the first animal trail, I watered down the tampon and chip and stepped the scent in, then watered them down again and continued on. The sun was down now, and only the sky was lighting my way as I passed by the bottleneck. I stopped to water the attachments and stepped them in, and as I did that, I heard a branch snap back down the trail, about what I would figure to be a couple 100 yards. I moved out and started to hear moaning coming from down the trail. The moans sounded like moo-wah, moo-wah. I started to run, but it was hard to see. I pulled my knife and cut the string and threw it down the trail, and I climbed a small balsam tree. The tree was about 8 inches in diameter. I got as far up as the branches would allow, wrapped my arms around the trunk, and kept totally quiet. I could hear the moaning and sound of steps coming closer down the trail. I could hear it stop and the sound of breathing, then steps again getting closer. It was right under me on the trail. Then a loud moan and a snort of air, and it was shaking my tree. I couldn't see a thing. I was terrified. I could then hear it trying to climb my tree and branches breaking. Then again, and again. At one point, it seemed to be right under my feet. I started to yell. I drew my knife and tried to climb higher, but the branches were too small. The breathing seemed to be right under my feet, but then it started crashing again to the ground. Then in the distance, down the trail, I heard a high-pitched whine like a wee-ah! Under me, it went silent. I stayed in the tree motionless, almost in tears from fear. After about a half hour not hearing anything more below me, I undid my pistol belt and wrapped it around the tree trunk and put my arm through it so it can act as a harness. I stayed in that tree all night and did not come down until it was completely light out. My arm was numb, and my left leg was in massive pain from the way it was bent. When I started down the tree, the branches about 4 feet below where I had been trapped had been all but snapped off. I had to hang and drop at least 10 feet to the ground. I ran back to the main road and got to the trail, then back to camp, then to my truck, and sped for home. I left both the cams and tent there. I just wanted to get home. It was around 8:30 a.m. when I got home. At 1 p.m., I went back for the cams in the tent. There were no pictures, and the camp was untouched. Tomorrow, I plan on going back armed to take pictures of the tree and look for the tracks. I don't know what it was. It was big and very determined to get me in the tree. The next day I went back to the tree. The first thing I noticed were there were no scratches or claw marks of any kind on the tree trunk. To me, this ruled out a bear. Whenever I saw a tree that a bear climbed in the past, it always left claw marks. I then started to take pictures of the tree from different angles before I approached it looking for hair tracks. My next search was to go and look for the string with attachments that I threw, but it was gone, nowhere to be found. However, about 75 yards from the tree was a very large patch of area laid flat, about 12 foot by 12 foot, like something was rolling around. I took a picture of that and returned to the tree. I looked over the broken off branches on the ground for hair. Nothing. I moved the branches so I could check the ground for impressions or tracks. It was packed ground, so it was hard to tell. Nothing that I could see that would indicate bear or squatch. There was a strong odor in the whole area, even on the tree. It smelled like wet dog to me, but it also had the balsam scent, but the wet dog overpowered it. The cherry tree that was next to the balsam was also broken down. It most likely broke the fall, whatever this thing was. I went back to the campsite. The apples I laid down did not get touched. The liver was still there, just covered in flies. And the licorice was also still there. Now I started to follow the path I took when dragging the scent trail. Before I got to the trail leading around the waterfowl refuge, I found a fresh trail that was not there before. I believe this is where it came from. I took a picture of that and continued on. After a while, I came to the bottleneck, and a bit further down where there was a tree. I made it to the main road and looked back. I could not help but feel disappointed that I found nothing. But then I started thinking as I continued to the campsite, if it was easy, we would have had a squatch years ago. I have no doubt that if the tree had been larger and the branches stronger, this thing would have made its way all the way up to me. I will do the scent trail tactic again, but with lessons learned. I have raised 2 black bears from cub to adult and watched hundreds of other wild bears, and my experience says it was not a black bear. I cannot say for sure if it was a Bigfoot either. Also, the whining howl that called off the attack, what was that? Not a bear, not a coyote, not a wolf. And even though it was as loud as and as high-pitched as a bull elk bugle, it was no elk. I didn't even hear the attacker leave. It just got all quiet. My wife asked me would I have been more scared if I could see it. I told her no, because it's the same with the ocean. If you are in dark water and something bumps you and you can't see it, you will be more scared. But if you can see it and know what it is, then you can prepare.